If you have a culture in which people who are always solving a crisis get rewarded, get the most attention, what you're going to end up with is an environment, an organization in which there's always lots of crises. When we're debriefing a situation, who do we applaud? The person who jumped in and put out the fire, but maybe caused themselves, or the person who always delivers on time and under budget, but without a lot of fanfare?
You're listening to How to Make a Leader, a leadership development podcast from Big Think Plus, where we take the best ideas from the biggest minds in learning and development and distill them into actionable insights. I'm your host, Hannah Beaver. In 2024, it's estimated that the leadership development market is valued at $81 billion. In the next 10 years, it's estimated to grow to a valuation of $217 billion. But with the fast pace of modern business and evolving global challenges, are we really preparing our leaders for today's complexities? And how can lessons from leaders in the past empower leaders in the present? Joining us to answer this question is Martin Gutmann, author of The Unseen Leader and professor of management at Lucerne University in Switzerland. He has dedicated his career to learning how leadership works across different historical contexts. Martin argues that many of the lessons we think we know about leadership, particularly those loud, crisis-driven narratives we often celebrate, might not necessarily be the most viable examples for us to follow today. In this conversation, we talk about the ways that we can reframe the way we identify and develop leaders at our organizations. Martin shares lessons from historical and contemporary figures, giving us key takeaways on how to think more deeply about leadership in today's unpredictable world. And we'll start our conversation there with a historical look back. I heard in prior podcasts and prior conversations that you've had, I wrote down a quote because I thought it was great, that you make it your business to untangle individual influence with broader historical events, kind of finding secrets and stories in past leaders. And I just thought that was such a fascinating way to frame it, an interesting way to put it. And, for that reason, I'm very excited for your perspective today, because I think, obviously, as you know, we can learn a lot from history, but you also have kind of that contemporary knowledge and leadership as well. So I think it's going to be a really great conversation today. I'm very excited. So again, we appreciate having you here. So why don't we just start out with a simple question that I think I already know the answer to, but is history a useful lens in which to examine and explore leadership? And if so, why?
Yes. The answer is an unequivocal yes. Certainly my perspective, at least. And there's many reasons, but maybe first off, I would say that leadership is important enough and complex enough that we really should use as many perspectives, as many disciplines and toolkits as we can muster to try to understand it. So I don't think history is the, or necessarily even the best perspective, or academic discipline to use, but it's certainly one very valuable one. And there's a couple different advantages that I see to it. If I ask you, Hannah, about the Corfu incident of 1923, does that evoke any strong emotions in you?
I can't say that it does, no.
Yeah, exactly. That's probably true for most people, right? But if I say the war in Ukraine or Israel-Gaza, we all have really strong opinions, emotional reactions to that, as we should, because this impacts us today, people we care about, we read about it in the news, we see pictures, right? And so this distance in time actually enables us to take a more scientific, I would say, more neutral perspective on trying to untangle, what was the actual influence of this one person on these bigger events, without letting our emotions and other kind of baggage we have in the present color our interpretation. So that's one advantage, I would say. The other is that very often, this sounds a bit counterintuitive, we actually have better sources at our disposal for events that occurred in the past. Because, if we're talking about government records, for example, they're often unavailable for 20, 30 years after an event. Mm-hmm. So, for example, we can't really untangle the decision-making process that led to George Bush's invasion of Iraq in 2003, because most of the records aren't available. right? But in another 10, 20, 30 years, they will be. And we'll also have all the memoirs of the people involved, and we'll have that little bit of distance to where we can really understand and untangle what went on, what were the consequences, etc. So I think distance, to some extent, is actually, enables a better inquiry than something that we're kind of wrapped up in ourselves in one way or another.
Yeah, I suppose it provides more of kind of a 360, more holistic view of all the accounts, what went on, the facts. And I feel like also historically too, we're removing a little bit more emotion associated with the event. Like you mentioned, current day events, there's going to be more emotion and current dialogue that's going on. So yeah, I think that's certainly such a fascinating point. I'd love to call out your book, The Unseen Leader, which I know you just released pretty much exactly a year ago. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, today a year ago.
Yeah. Wow. Wonderful timing. We didn't even plan it that way. But in your book, you call out various leaders from different, time phases, whether that be, polar exploration, World War I, World War II. One of the main hypotheses in your book is around the action fallacy. So I'd love for you to tell us, what is the action fallacy and why is it such a helpful lens through which to examine leadership?
What I term the action fallacy. Our tendencies to associate good leadership with noise and sensational activity in dramatic circumstances. I use the example in the book of a river. So let's imagine we have two, not leaders now, but two swimmers, and they're going to try to cross a river. And the first one just kind of plunges in, hasn't taken the time to, get to know the river, where the current's flowing, where are the hidden rocks and the dangers. So the first guy just jumps in, starts making his way across, nearly drowns, and then, starts splashing around and fighting and making all kinds of noise and somehow manages to get back to safety, whether that's on the other side of the river or back where he started. We're going to notice that person, right? He's, it's hard not to.
Mm-hmm.
And if the second swimmer, if she has really taken the time to understand the river, knows how the currents flow, her swim across might be entirely uneventful, might not be anything worth looking at. And if we only see her, we might say, that's not that impressive. I could do that. And that's what the action fallacy at work. That is our tendency to focus in on the people who make the most noise, who get wrapped up in the most drama, even if a lot of that drama was caused by themselves or could have been avoided. And there's lots of historical examples here. The one I start off with in the book is around these famous explorers from around 100 years ago. So there's Ernest Shackleton, an Anglo-Irish explorer who essentially failed every time he tried to, mount an expedition, sometimes spectacularly, right? A lot of drama, a lot of near death, some death as well. But he's really well remembered. There's lots of books. There's even lots of business school case studies, leadership case studies based on Ernest Shackleton. And on the other hand, we have this Norwegian, Roald Amundsen, who is, if you use any kind of objective measure, the absolute rock star of exploration. I mean, he achieved all of the goals that there were in polar exploration, the North and the South Poles, the Northeast and the Northwest Passage, without any fuss, without any drama. And I think for that reason, right, we overlook him. He's kind of been forgotten if we look at what the authorities on these periods, the historians who actually study these periods, have to say. The leaders who were the most influential have kind of remained unseen to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
And what was interesting was I started finding that this is not just a conclusion that I came to as a historian, but it's a conclusion that lots of organizational psychologists studying leadership today have arrived at as well. There's this Babel hypothesis. Neil McLaren from Binghamton is a big proponent of this, which essentially says, whoever speaks the most in any organizational setting will be perceived as having the most leadership potential. Doesn't matter what the person's saying, right? And similarly, whoever kind of does the most, whoever seems the most busy, again, signals leadership potential to us, when in fact, I think we all intuitively know that just doing a lot doesn't mean you're actually, moving things in the right direction. You could be backpedaling for all we know.
I think everyone can think of an example of a leader that they have interacted with or, has been a leader in their life that definitely is perhaps the loudest, as you mentioned, speaks the most, makes their presence the most known. So I think that's definitely something that's very relatable.
Definitely.
I think it's interesting too, you mentioned, with the two examples of the polar explorers as well, those with the best stories, as you mentioned, are kind of the most memorable. And it also makes me think of how, I just feel like as humans, we are kind of drawn towards the drama sometimes, the interesting story to tell. And that is, a huge reason, I'm sure, as to why we do cling on to those leaders that have the more interesting story, the ones that were flailing in the water rather than, calmly navigating their way through, the stream. So I think that's such an interesting way to frame it.
And, to be fair, that's not in and of itself a bad thing. Great stories are fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
I think the key is just to be deliberate about what we're trying to accomplish. So, if you want to make a movie about a polar explorer, I would pick Shackleton. His adventures were always much more exciting.
Mm-hmm.
It follows the Hollywood plot. Amundsen's diaries are not as exciting to read. It's a lot of humdrum. I planned it this way, and this is exactly how it worked out. That was not true for Shackleton and a lot of the others. So looking for a good story, there's lots of great people to go to, but they might not be the people you want to look at if you're trying to extract leadership and management lessons.
So to kind of bring this to, leadership development in organizations today, how do we solve this action fallacy that we see in organizations? And how would you say that we can apply this and really think about this in the context of leadership development?
Well, I think there's a couple different ways to answer that question. The first thing is to say that I think the action fallacy both applies to how we select or who we identify as having leadership potential. So it's something we need to guard against when we are, looking around for promoting somebody or kind of, picking somebody out from the crowd to lead our team or whatever it might be. But I think it's also, we're often trained to behave this way ourselves as leader as well, because a lot of the leadership role models we have behave exactly this way, that when in doubt, do something, right? If the ship is sinking, then start making a lot of noise, etc. It's not always the wrong reaction, right? I mean, if there really is a time-sensitive emergency, you can't sit around and deliberate forever. You gotta do something. But very often, I think we should guard against this inclination to jump in, to make noise, etc. Especially if we want to cultivate and enable, a team to actually be proactive, to work well together. If we're always rushing in with the solutions and the answers and instructions, people will just defer to us and stop kind of thinking along. So I think that can be quite destructive, that form of leadership. The other thing I would say is that the strength of a historical perspective for leadership studies, I think, is that historians really privilege context or take a lot of time to understand the context. And I think there's a temptation to come up with these generalizable, one-size-fits-all leadership truths. So I think that's the other lesson there, that we really need to understand the context that we're in before we, extract any general leadership truths.
What do the best leaders have in common, both from a historical and contemporary standpoint? And I'd love if you could kind of maybe break down some of the attributes that we see in the most successful leaders, again, from both a historical and contemporary standpoint.
As I said before, I'm generally wary of these kind of truths that apply universally. I think, again, first understanding the context is key. And maybe one concrete example here is that, in the book, I look at these explorers, Roald Amundsen and Shackleton and a few others. I also look at the political leaders during the Second World War, kind of profile the role that Winston Churchill played in creating a winning strategy and a winning alliance in that conflict. And in Churchill's case, communication it's not the only key to success, but it's one of them, right? He's both coordinating the work of lots of different government offices and the military, et cetera. So it's a communication challenge, right? You have to get all these people aligned around your vision and kind of understanding the tasks that you are putting to them. So he really is a master communicator, and that's something he takes advantage of. Of course, also his communication to the population as a whole. But from that, I wouldn't extract communication as the sort of, the key that every leader needs to perfect in every scenario. Because if you look at Amundsen, he's leading a crew of 6 or 7, later on in his expeditions, a few more. But these are kind of really small teams in very confined quarters. Of course, he still has to communicate with them, but it's an entirely different communication channel. From what we can glean from the people who are around him, he wasn't a particularly good communicator. Kind of had an awkward style of speaking. His writing isn't that captivating, if we're perfectly honest. That was not the key to his success, but it didn't have to be either. With that said, I think something a lot of great leaders have in common is that they find a balance between confidence and humility. And incidentally, this is, not something that I'm the first to highlight. A lot of contemporary research highlights this as well. And being too far on one or the other end of the spectrum is not productive for you as a leader, right? If you're overconfident, that's of course no good, right? You need to have a little bit of humility. You need to accept and acknowledge the fact that you might not have all the right answers in all the circumstances, right? And your first opinion may be wrong, et cetera, right? So having a little bit of doubt, I think, is quite healthy. But too much of that, on the other hand, if you second guess everything you do and say, and you're too worried about what other people are going to think, that's not good either. So you really need to thread the needle there between confidence and humility. And here, maybe to make a link to, contemporary scenarios, there was a great paper just a few years ago by Basima Tafik, who is a professor at MIT, and she found that medical students who have a little bit of doubt, right, who have a little bit of imposter syndrome, aren't sure, do I really have what it takes to be a doctor? They actually did no worse in diagnosing patients correctly than the medical students who had no doubt about their capabilities. However, those with a little bit of doubt with imposter syndrome were rated much higher by the patients in areas like professionalism, empathy,
bedside
et cetera. I think there's a strong case to be made for this need for some humility, empathy, this skill set. I think
and emotional intelligence.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I guess my follow-up question to you, and I guess we've kind of just covered this, but I'm thinking of those listening to our conversation today that their role is to create, leadership development programs at their organization. And part of that is going to be around focusing on core skills and which competencies to develop amongst, rising leaders and existing leaders too. So, we've touched on 2 of them. I know we talked about communication with exception, not just the blanket communication, and we've just gone over emotional intelligence. I'm curious if there are any other skills that you can think of. Again, feel free to use examples, both historical or contemporary. Any other skills that if you were in their shoes creating this leadership development program, that you think this is a key skill that I've seen across history and across contemporary examples that really is applicable and, universally is a skill that we should be developing in leaders today. Do you have 1 or 2 skills that you would share there?
Well, I think another one that we find in a lot of successful leaders, both of the past and today, is a contextual fluency, right? A deep familiarity with the area that they're working in, especially if we're thinking of more complex endeavors like politics, like leading large companies, et cetera. I do think a lot of leadership, a lot of the leadership toolkit is transferable. If you're a good communicator in one area, you can probably, with slight changes or adjustments, be a good communicator in another area as well. Empathy, I think, transfers well, right? But those things are often not enough. You really need a fundamental understanding for the problems and the challenges that you are facing in the industry or the the scenarios that you find yourselves in. So I saw this, the historical leaders I looked at who were very successful in their arenas, the explorers, Churchill, and I also look at Gertrude Bell, who kind of the primary facilitator of Arab independence in the aftermath of the First World War. They had all spent a lifetime trying to understand. They really had a passion for this area that they would later work in and be so influential in. And I think that's not to be underestimated, because often good leadership involves, creating structures or creating a work culture that aligns with the challenges that you're facing. And that's not something you can replicate from somewhere else. You really need to understand the environment you're in. And interestingly here too, there is contemporary research on this as well. So I immediately think of the book by Amanda Goodall, who's a professor at Warwick in the UK, The Power of Expert Leaders, right? So she looks at doctors who become administrators of hospitals tend to do better than administrators who are not doctors. University administrators who come from the academic side tend to lead the universities better by all metrics that we have. Coaches who are players themselves, et cetera, right? So there really is something to be said for somebody who's fluent in the area that they're working in.
Great. And what would you say makes leadership more difficult today compared to in the past, in historical examples that we've talked about?
I mean, this is a question we could debate endlessly, right? Is our current point in time unique? Mm-hmm. Or are the challenges we face today with AI, with the climate catastrophe, with geopolitical tensions around the world, are we at some kind of unique moment in time? Some things point to yes. I mean, there are some things that truly are, it's the first time we're seeing them as a human race. But many things, I would say, while not in the details the same, have a lot of echoes of the past. So the term that's really in vogue these days, or has been for the last decade, is VUCA, to describe kind of an environment that's variable, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And that does capture the world today quite well, right? A lot of things we take for granted today are different tomorrow, right? It's like a constantly evolving landscape. Churchill used all four of the VUCA words to describe the challenge he faced during the Second World War. He just never put them together and called it VUCA. But if you look at his writing, they're all there. They're there for a reason, because this was the reality of what he was facing as well. So I think if we look historically, there are periods of stability and there are periods of instability of kind of a VUCA world. And I think leadership is, of course, unlike, management, we're just kind of, how do we deal with the predictable things, the things that are complex but predictable? We create budgets, we create organizational charts. That's where we use our management toolkit. Leadership is, of course, exactly for these times where there is a lot of uncertainty. We don't know what's going to happen. So I think if we look at the flow of time, there are, times or there are organizations or moments when you could really manage your way through this, and other times where it's really a leadership challenge. And I think we're definitely in a leadership moment again, whether we're talking about industry or politics or society in general. And what is unique about today, I would say, is that the pace of change is truly unique, right? Where, the capabilities of generative AI, for example, that we saw just last year have been fundamentally transformed in a year, and next year is probably going to be the same. And the same with the climate crisis. I think we're used to it both in industry and in policy to kind of plan in, quarter century timeframes. If we're going to build new bridges and roads, that's not something you do overnight, but our environment is changing so rapidly that we do need to find ways to be a bit quicker about it. So I think those are characteristics of the present day that are truly unique.
I wanted to bring up a statistic that you opened your book with. You shared that in 2011, US companies spent $14 billion on leadership development. By 2018, 7 years later, that number increased to $50 billion. So, like you mentioned, leadership is very much in vogue. I mean, it's always been, a popular topic, but it's very much a focus. And I think, obviously, you mentioned the concept of VUCA and how everything is changing. There's always some sort of crisis to manage, or everything is changing at such a rapid pace. And so I'd be curious to hear, what are you seeing in terms of trends and which way this is going? Are you seeing more organizations investing more? Have you observed kind of any shifts in the way that we're approaching leadership just in the past few years, perhaps post-pandemic even? Anything you're noticing right now that's, a particularly glamorous, trendy, those new terms that you found interesting that you'd like to share?
The trend is upwards, right? That companies and organizations are spending more on leadership development. Depends on, which report you consult. You'll arrive at slightly different numbers for the global investment there. But it's certainly something that remains a hot topic. And I would say for good reasons, right? We need better leadership capabilities in organizations, in politics, in society, not just because the world is complex, but I think also because this is a very good thing. The standards that we expect have increased, right? I think in the 60s and the 70s, there were a lot of unhealthy work environments, certainly if you were not a white man, and that's no longer acceptable for good reason. But that means we need more and we need better leaders who can lead in an empathetic and inclusive way. So I think the investment, I don't think it's a fad. I think it's a good thing that people are investing in it. And it is something that can be learned.
If you had to distill all of your knowledge and research on leadership into one piece of advice, what would that be?
One of the things that one of the running coaches I really like said, that I think applies to leadership as well, is that it really is an experiment of one. That is, I can use all these insights and all this data and all these tips, but my body is different from everybody else's, and the terrain I run on, and, it's all unique to me. And so at the end of the day, I have to be willing to kind of run this continual experiment on myself and with myself. It doesn't make sense for me to invent or, kind of experiment my way forwards to the best nutrition. It makes sense for me to consult all the science that's out there, but I have to be open to the fact that it might not work with me the way it did for most of the people in the study that I'm reading, et cetera. It is an experiment with me, and I have to continually kind of, try these things out and see how does it work in my environment. I think that's the best approach to leadership development as well, that there are a lot of truths out there, but, it's about one human relating to other humans, and we are all unique, and you really have to find the way that fits best with who you are and the people that you're around.
To kind of take theory to practice again, how can we develop powerful leaders at our organization? And I'd love to ask this in the context of, in your book, you mention what we call in business innovation literature, the reframe. So could you dig a little bit into what the reframe is, why we need to reframe our thinking about leadership, and how we can then go on and develop powerful leaders within our organizations?
The reframe comes from kind of design thinking literature that came out of the Stanford Design School a decade, 2 decades ago. And it's this idea that, at the start of an innovation journey, you should really question the assumptions that you bring to the table and question the assumptions you have regarding the problem that you're looking at. And maybe there's a healthier and truer way of looking at this issue. So, can you reframe it? Mm-hmm. And that's essentially what I'm trying to do with the action fallacy. It's trying to reframe who we see as the people with the most leadership potential, who are best, in the best position to develop into strong leaders. And so there, I think it's a matter of unbiasing ourselves, right? We need to stop looking always for the loudest people, for the white men, the people who are kind of making a lot of noise, and trying to find those who actually, maybe in more subtle and quiet ways, are moving their teams or enabling a team culture that promotes true collaboration and promotes collaborative solutions to the problem that a team is facing.
I'd love to dig into the point that you make around, we tend to kind of put on a pedestal and promote those individuals that are perhaps louder. I believe you called it captains of crisis at one point in the book, that love to, have a crisis, resolve the crisis, perhaps be a little bit louder and more in your face, if you will, about their leadership capabilities, what they're doing, and showing that to the team. So who should we be looking to among teams that perhaps exemplify, stellar leadership qualities, but perhaps aren't as loud about it? Where should we be looking and how should we be looking for those types of people?
I think, to be honest, it's not just a matter of looking in different places, but it's a matter of creating a different culture in your organization. So I think it starts with hiring. I'm not an expert in kind of HR policies and hiring, but I know there are a lot of biases. And if we tend to put in these action-oriented words in job ads, we need somebody who can drive change, who is powerful, this and that, you're going to get a lot of these kind of action-oriented men applying for the job. And those are also the people you're going to hire because they fit the description that you wrote yourself, right? So kind of unbiasing ourselves starts with how we hire people in the first place. It doesn't even have to be in leadership roles. But I also think if you have a culture in which people who are always solving a crisis get rewarded, get the most attention, what you're going to end up with is an environment, an organization in which there's always lots of crises, or people are always describing things as a crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that's healthy.
Creating a crisis, if you will.
Exactly, yeah. Mm-hmm. And as you mentioned before, I refer to some of these, action-oriented types as captains of crisis in my book, right? They're always finding themselves in a crisis because they failed to plan properly or failed to, circumvent it when it first appeared. Mm-hmm. Or they're simply just describing things with a sense of urgency that might not even be necessary because they've learned this is how I get the attention from my boss. So it kind of starts with the culture that you said. Who gets rewarded, whether that's monetarily, but perhaps even more so in recognized when we're debriefing a situation. Who do we applaud? The person who jumped in and put out the fire, but maybe caused themselves, or the person who always delivers on time and under budget, but without a lot of fanfare. So I think it starts there. And I was also going to say, we were talking before about leadership development. I think a lot of that also has to do with the climate, with the culture in an organization. So if there's not psychological safety, right, if people feel like I can't make mistakes, I can't take risks, that will really hamper the leadership potential and the leadership development that you have in the team, because people will be really busy trying not to mess up, or if they do mess up, having you not notice it, right? And they're trying to conform when in fact maybe what they can contribute might not look exactly the same way that your leadership style does, but it fit perfectly with the team that they're leading. So the psychological safety, I think, is key as well. It's of course easier said than done. But.
Yeah. I agree. We went to a conference a few months back, and we asked folks at the conference who are all leadership development and learning and development and HR professionals about kind of the most important attributes that they believe that a leader should possess, and psychological safety popped up a lot, And as you said, easier said than done. We all want to create that psychological safety on a team, but it's clearly something that is extremely important and allows teams to thrive under leaders that can create that psychological safety. So it's definitely something that I hear and talk about a lot and definitely agree with you on. Okay, my last question for you. And I know we don't necessarily like to pick favorites around here, and everything comes within context, but I'm curious, do you have a favorite leader that you've studied, or one leader that you believe everyone should try to emulate as they, progress on their own leadership journey or elevating others into their leadership journeys?
I'm going to pick somebody who's, I guess, kind of a historical figure by this point, but still a bit contemporary. It's Bill Cartwright. Do you know who that is?
I don't. Please tell me more.
Most people probably don't. I will tell you who Bill Cartwright is. So this is a bit of a longer story, but I'll try to keep it somewhat brief. Yeah. So Michael Jordan joined the Chicago Bulls in the early 1980s. I think it was 83 or 84. High performer from day one, right? A scoring average that I think some people have surpassed, but is hard to surpass. Mm-hmm. But the Bulls weren't winning championships. Phil Jackson comes on board as the coach in around 85, plus minus. And one change that Phil Jackson as the coach makes that really enables the Bulls to become this dominant, this fantastic team that wins 6 championships in the 90s. It's a phenomenal feat, right? Is that he promotes Bill Cartwright, who is by this point, if I can be honest, a bad basketball player. Right? He's got a bad knee. It's totally past his prime. Mm-hmm. Doesn't hit many shots. right? In fact, Michael Jordan often singled him out in practice. Michael Jordan was really hard on people. He singled out Bill Cartwright in practice and would say, if you passed Bill, I'm never going to pass to you again. That's something Jordan actually said. Phil Jackson makes Bill Cartwright co-captain with Michael Jordan.
Wow. And
that season, they start winning and win their first championship. So this is in about 1991. And, so what is it that Bill Cartwright has, right? He's not the greatest basketball player anymore. He has this ability to relate to all of the other players. He's very empathetic. He kind of creates an environment of psychological safety. And to balance out, I think the other thing you need for a high-performance team is this emphasis on performance, on always wanting to win, which Michael Jordan has. But together, they're this perfect combination of on-the-court leaders. But of course, we tend to zero in on Michael Jordan. I mean, he's an amazing athlete, so why not? But Bill Cartwright's kind of the forgotten hero of the Chicago Bulls, and that I think makes him one of my favorite leaders.
I love that. We love an underdog story too. So I'll definitely have to look him up after this conversation. Great. Well, thank you very much for your time and insights today. I certainly learned a lot. I really enjoyed hearing the historical examples and how we can apply them in the modern context. So thank you very much for your insights today.
Thank you so much, Anna. It was a pleasure.
For more from Martin Gutmann, check out the show notes for a link to his book, The Unseen Leader. For more from How to Make a Leader, make sure you subscribe so you never miss an episode. We'll be back next month and every month with another L&D expert. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on How to Make a Leader.